Hello and welcome to episode 2 of You Love Us. In this episode, we'll be looking at the period from Gold Against the Soul through to the Holy Bible, the impact of that album, and then the very sad events that led up to and surrounded the disappearance of Richey. So now we're in this period of 1993, 1994, between Gold Against the Soul and leading up to the release of the Holy Bible. The band were becoming accustomed to this new fame. Generation Terrorist had made them notorious. Gold Against the Soul had got them onto the covers of smash hits and got them onto Top of the Pops and got them onto the MTV video rotation, and this was their first true taste of fame. You know, they as a band in interviews, they became more and more, I don't know, vitriolic. That's such a big word, isn't it? But it's a word that would be used in wordy lyrics at some point, no doubt. Nicky, for one, was always pushing back against other bands.
I mean, Morrissey's just a sad old bit of man, and he'll do anything to get press. You know, he just likes irritating people. I think it's a rock star thing. I want to be misunderstood, you know. It's an appalling thing to say, and it's just the way what he is, I think, now, what he's become.
There would always be this pushback against the Manchester scene, against anything that was seen as mainstream or corporatized, which was quite funny given that Gold Against the Soul was a fairly corporatized album. It was an album that was, you know, from the record label, was designed to get them fame and infamy. You know, we mentioned last time about the musical influences on Gold Against the Soul, about how sometimes they were too obvious, and was that really an effort to make that album way more accessible? That doesn't detract from how good that album is, but it's not their best. It's not really what the band were about. So we've got this period between Generation Terrorist, which is just a phenomenal punk album. It just really is. It has the right ethic and the right feel and the right beat and the right tempo. It has everything there. Towards the Holy Bible, which we would learn over time would become nihilism, would become an unforeseen full stop for the band. You know, or some people will call it a comma, you know, a pause. But musically and lyrically, the Holy Bible became a full stop. So you've got this period of this band, these young lads, and don't forget that coming from Blackwood, they came from predominantly working class backgrounds, and yes, they'd grown up watching their heroes being interviewed, and the words coming from their heroes, or the words from their teachers, or the words from their readings, and they were mashing all this up into their opinions, and Richey was becoming more and more and more and more the mouthpiece, the spokesperson for the band. He was designing the direction, the intellectual direction of how the band would be thought of.
All the people you grew up with die. Mm-hmm. You know, your parents die, your grandparents die, your dog dies. You know, your energy diminishes. There's less books to read. There's no more groups to discover. You know, you just end up a barren wasteland, just trying to find something new.
James was writing the music, and James, as we go into the Holy Bible, we can talk about James's musical influences of that period, and they are significantly different to some of the musical influences from Generation Terrorists and Gold Against the Soul. There's some big changes coming there, but it was Richey who was experienced the biggest changes. You know, his physical health and his mental health, as the band were pushed to do more and more and more, he was becoming less and less and less. And these are lads that have grown up together to watch their friend, their comrade, disappear into his black pit of depression, anxiety, self-loathing, anorexia. It must have been incredibly difficult for them. And you just look at some of the interviews at that time, and if it was happening now, there's more opportunity to ring alarm bells. And I think we are more finely tuned as a community, whether it be a community of fans or a community of concerned people. We can see things better. We've learned over the past 25 years what mental health looks like. And I think that the thing with Richey is that he would never admit it himself, but he was screaming for help. And sometimes the closer you are, the less you see. And there's no blame to be apportioned to the rest of the band or the management system of the band at the time. But Richey's lyrics, Richey's statements, his interview answers became darker and darker and darker. In some ways, you could say that 93 was, I don't know, like a ghost year. It didn't have the chaos of Generation Terrorists. You know, it didn't have the cutting razor's edge of 94 with the Holy Bible. It was a year of, well, it should have been a year where they were consolidating and growing stronger as a band, and to some degrees they were, but the other degrees, the pressures were starting to fray at the edges. You know, Richey was trying to play more guitar. By his own admission, you know, he made some noise, but sometimes it was somebody kneeling down behind a curtain at the back of the stage that was playing for him. And that didn't detract from what we saw as fans, but it played in our minds. Some interview quotes from 93 show where the band were at. If we look at James from the Reading Festival in 93, if we weren't in this band, we'd be dead. We've got nowhere else to go. Nicky in 93 in the NME said, "I hate the NME. They're like the school bullies who loved you for 5 minutes and then threw you in the bin." Richey, "It's not rebellion, it's depression. Really, I just feel empty most of the time." And surprisingly, even Sean, "We're not here to make friends. We're here to make records that make you feel something, even if it's nausea." Okay. The thing that the band had a direction, they had an opinion. And if we go back to 93, unlike so many other bands at that time, they weren't afraid to express their opinion. Sometimes their opinions were uncomfortable and were ugly. Sometimes they were bang on, you know. But you can never accuse the Manics in that period leading up to the Holy Bible of being quiet or softly spoken. 1993 became 1994. The band were writing the Holy Bible. They were performing. They were continuing on that upward trajectory. But I think the biggest problem for the band, for their friendship, the unit, was Richey's decline. It was becoming more and more marked. His commentary on life, his narration for the band was getting darker and darker and darker. And this culminated in June of 94 with him disappearing for 2 days, going on a binge of self-destruction. He weighed at the time of admission to the Priory. Nicky said about 6 stone, which for anybody that can do the maths, a 25-year-old man, 5'7", 5'8", 6 stone is scary thin. He'd been self-harming again. He'd been really struggling, and this was obviously a precursor to what would happen in the following year. He stayed in the Priory for 10 weeks. Which obviously took over the time of the release of the Holy Bible. The press release was that it was nervous exhaustion, but I think that only amplified when the Holy Bible came out. People's need to interpret the lyrics as a as to why Richey was doing the things he was doing. And not everything in the Holy Bible is directly about Richey. That would be presumptuous to say that it's a biographical album. It's not. There are a lot of his experiences, a lot of his issues, and a lot of his thought processes in there, but it's not just about him. And I think that period, the missing for 2 days, the Priory stay, only amplified that within people's minds. And I think that, again, most probably did Richey a bit of a disservice. You know, he was more than the words that were on the page. And it was an incredibly difficult period for the band. You know, that their friend, their fourth member, wasn't there with them. You know, the pressure and the tensions were mounting as they had to do their press tours, their promotions for the album. Although this comes from a later interview in December of '94 with the Melody Maker, it's an unwanted view into Richey's mind. The best thing is knowing that no one can do fucking anything about it. People can't actually hold you down and force food into your mouth. They just can't do it. And somebody can't be near you 24 hours a day to stop you doing something to your body. And ultimately, they've got no right to anyway. It's incredibly hard to think of anybody, whether they be a famous person or a not famous person, but having that in their head and that being how they're living, it's heartbreaking, I think. And as a fan, looking back to the band at that time, you know, we still had the echoes of You Love Us in our head, and we still had the echoes of Roses in the Hospital in our head. But there was one of the band slipping away, slowly but surely disappearing. And what would we have done now? It would have been so different now, but that wasn't to be. The recording of the Holy Bible would be almost the polar opposite of Gold Against the Soul. Gone was the £2,000 a day fancy studio, and in came Soundspace Studios in Cardiff, a small studio, by all accounts tiny and not exactly the nicest place to be, but it was somewhere where the band felt that they could get back to grassroots, get back to their own direction, their own sound and the way of work and the way of thinking. And I think when we listen to the album, you can tell straight away that overly produced, overly commercialized aspect of Gold Against the Soul has gone right out the window. This is more akin in production style to Generation Terrorists. It sounds more like Generation Terrorists than Gold Against the Soul. It's interesting that when we look at Gold Against the Soul, you know, that the influences that were on the sleeve were very famous, large American bands. As we get into looking at the Holy Bible, we will see, yeah, there's still some American bands in there, but there are more English bands that we can reference as musical inspirations. The recording of the Holy Bible was done in a very controlled and disciplined fashion. They would have headings and structures predefined and write to those. Richey would turn up at the recording sessions, but wouldn't typically contribute. His favourite pastime was snoozing on the settee. Bradfield said that the day would normally start with the sound of a can opening. Whilst James took the heavy lifting of the music, the construction of the songs, it was thought at the time that Richey contributed 70-75% of the lyrics. I think that's been revised somewhat over the years by Nicky as he's looked back at notebooks and reviewed pages, and it's kind of like maybe apportioned that a little bit less to Richey and more equalised to Nicky, which is no bad thing. James has said that some of the lyrics confused him, that he felt uncomfortable singing some of the lyrics because he had no way of understanding them, really. He had no reference point in his life to the pain that was being portrayed, and talked about feeling like an imposter at times. A bit of full disclosure here. When I first listened to the Holy Bible, I don't know whether I connected with it. I truly appreciate the seismic impact of that album now, but I'm not sure whether me as an average working class white man at that time truly understood what was in the songs, what they were singing about. And a bit like James said, he felt like an imposter. I had no reference point in my life to so much of the pain in this album. And musically, I could connect with it, but lyrically, it took me a while. And now, I fully appreciate how seismic the impact of this album was and is in their career, and for us as fans. But it took me a while, and I often equate it to the first time I went to see The Exorcist. I think I was 15, and The Exorcist hasn't aged well. I know that. So if you're under 40 and you've not seen The Exorcist and you watch it now, you'll go, that's not scary. So replace the name of The Exorcist with the scariest film you've ever seen. Because when I saw The Exorcist for the first time, there were no films like that. That was the cutting edge of scary. And I went to see it, and I was scared. Yeah, I'll admit it was a great horror film. It gave me the jumps, it gave me the heebie-jeebies, it gave me all of those things. And I wasn't sure how often I wanted to experience that again. So as we got into home video and DVD, and The Exorcist became available for you to watch at home, and I owned a copy of it, I wasn't quite sure how often I wanted to go back, and I felt a little bit intimidated by it. And that's how initially I felt about the Holy Bible. I felt that I know it's great, but it makes me feel intimidated because I don't understand. And I wanted to understand, and I can never truly understand unless you've lived the things that they talk about. You can't truly understand. You can empathize, yeah, I get it, but you can't truly understand. Oh, I know how you feel. That's not how that works at all. Okay, so I felt intimidated by it. And is that a strange thing to admit about listening to an album? I'm intimidated by the album. I don't know. I don't care. That's how I felt. That was my relationship with that album. That is how I interacted with the band at that time. You know, they were one of my punk bands. They were a punk band that had gone a little bit too hair metal, but had come back. And when they came back, the music was there, but the lyrics had gone, and I wasn't quite sure. It took me a while, I've got to admit. It took me quite a few listens for me to really, truly appreciate what a masterpiece this album is. And it opens with yes. And you know, I can talk about rhyme and meter and tempo and guitar noises and channels and mixing and production. If you want that podcast, this isn't it. This podcast is about my passion and my love for the Manics. And yes, it's a brilliant song. It's an absolutely brilliant song. Its lyrics are messed up, but we're going to say that for every track. But to open the Holy Bible with any other track would have lessened the impact of the album. It grabs you by the throat and it shakes you and it says, wake up, we're here, this is a new album, sit down and listen, we're going to make you feel something. They could have quite easily kept that track, the actual musical content of that track, and put other lyrics over it. Okay? But the lyrics they chose are perfect for that track. And I love that song. In your unfair top 20 Manic Street Preachers songs of all time, which changes and what's your favourite and all that, Yes is always in my 20 because of the way it makes me feel. It is a masterpiece of a song and one hell of a way to open an album. The You Love Us podcast is brought to you by the very, very generous sponsorship from the band The Broken and the Dead. They've just released their first album, Fragments and Echoes, which includes the singles Fear, Heaven and How Does It Feel. It's available on all streaming platforms now. And we're not biased. Yes, they're sponsoring this podcast, but it's actually a damn fine album. Give it a try. The thing that always amazes me in the recording sessions that went in that tiny, dark, dirty studio with Richey asleep on the settee, with the pressure that the band was under at the time, with what they were singing about, what they were writing about, is that they stopped for a moment and wrote This Is Yesterday. For me, this is one of the most painfully beautiful songs the Manics have ever written. And I would dare to say it is one of the most beautiful songs that anybody has ever written. So how had the musical influences changed from Generation Terrorists to Gold Against the Soul to the Holy Bible? I said before that they went more British. Okay. 4 Stone 7 Pounds. Okay. We all know that song. It feels like it's inspired by the Jam. The bass line is almost a slowed down Eaton Rifles. For copyright reasons, I can't do it here, but just take the two side by side. That's not detracting from how good a song 4 Stone 7 Pounds is. Okay, we're talking about influences. We're not talking about copying or it's not a good song. Listen to influences, and when you can accept and incorporate an influence as good as the Jam in your music, I think you're onto a winner. Other bands that are there as influences would be Susie and the Banshees, Public Image Limited, Joy Division magazine. Of Walking Abortion feels to me like an Alice in Chains-ish kind of track. Again, not detracting from the quality, but it's wonderful to see these more in line with the band influences coming through. And I think James has been quite open about what he was listening to at that time and how that would have bled through into what he was recording. Commercial response to the album's release was good. Got to number 6 in the charts. Critical response was good as well. NME said that the Holy Bible isn't elegant, but it's bloody effective. I would disagree with that. Not that it's effective, that it's not elegant. I think it is a very elegant album. Melody Maker said it was the sound of a group in extremis hurtling towards its private Armageddon. Wow. Select Magazine said, and this is a long one, amid all the references to coma, carcasses, walking abortions and dying in the summertime sits the spectre of Richey, holed up in a private clinic, having drunk too much, eaten too little and cut himself for reasons varying between dramatic gesture, a surrogate for screaming out loud and something sexual. Let's hope that with a record of such unsettling morbid resonance as the Holy Bible, no further gestures are required. Bloody hell, mate, just say if it's a good album or not. You don't need to get so waxing lyrical. It's an album which is polarizing. It's an album which is defining. It is one of the few albums from any band that captures the period of that band so succinctly. That it says, this is the precursor to 95, to the changes for the band, to the issues with Richey. This is the band in that moment, almost entirely free of external interference on how it should sound and how they should write and how they should present themselves. This was a band at that time that had shaped their own destiny far more than many others. You know, even the Manchester scene with their faux indie credentials was still being steered by labels like Factory Records, Beggar's Banquet. They were still being steered and commercialised. Here was a band that would go on Top of the Pops, the really only television outlet for music, and perform faster with James wearing a balaclava. It garnered 25,000 complaints, and not all about them, not all about the song and not all about the performance. The majority of complaints were about the fact that there were open flames on stage next to them. Isn't it funny how some people can't understand what they're witnessing, and what they're witnessing is genius on stage? They're worried about naked flames. Ah, well. But the Holy Bible summarised everything the Manics had been through, everything that they had become, and at that stage, everything they knew how to be. Things were about to change in such a dreadful and shocking way for them, but at least they had that moment to live in.
It is an album that represents a quite fraught, but also a quite happy time in our lives. You know, we knew that we were making something special, and you don't get that feeling much sometimes. And sometimes, subsequently, you do end up doing something special, but you don't feel it at that moment in time. With the Bible, we actually felt that it was important. We felt that everything was at stake, and that we had, nothing to lose, because we felt like we were a band that had failed somewhat at that point, by not selling 27 million records and splitting up and all that kind of bollocks. And so kind of it was a moment in time, and obviously Richey was kind of like, he wasn't in such a bad shape when we were making that record. He was at the calm before the storm.
My love of the Holy Bible comes from the songs like Yes and Faster. It comes from the anger, the vitriol. It comes from the despair, from the pleading, from the painful observation of their lives, of our lives, of others' lives. That's what this album means to me. The band would tour the album initially without Richey. They'd play Tea in the Park. They'd go to Cologne, they'd play festivals in The Hague, they played Reading Festival. Richey then rejoined them for September, October, December, where they did a UK and mainland Europe tour with Suede and Therapy. And the year finished with them doing 3 nights at the London Astoria. So 94 finished as a successful year for the band. The album in the charts, the tours, very much in the mind of the fans. 95 started for them with plans of America. So now we need to talk about the disappearance of Richey. What I've done here is, from my other podcast, Between the Facts, I've taken the section about Richey's disappearance, so please excuse the deeper voice. I believe I had a cold at the time. On February the 1st, 1995, Richey disappeared. Gone. No notes, no phone calls, no explanations, nothing. It's one of those cases that will forever be unresolved. He just disappeared. So what do we know about his disappearance? The last known sighting of Richey was at the Embassy Hotel in London on the morning of February the 1st. He was due to fly to the United States that day with James Dean Bradfield to start a promotional tour. But he just never showed up at the airport. Absolutely. Yeah, never showed. 2 weeks later, on February the 14th, his car was found abandoned near the Severn Bridge. For anybody that knows the Severn Bridge, it's associated with suicide and suicide attempts. It's a hot spot, unfortunately. The police report noted that the car battery was dead, and reports suggested it had been there for several days. Well, I think the timeline would suggest 2 weeks. So, because there's so little information around his disappearance, what evidence can we piece together? You know, what can we say about Richey's state of mind leading up to the 1st of February? You know, we all know that he suffered with severe depression. Mixing that with his anorexia and his tendency for self-harming, then, you know, we saw this in all of his lyrics, and that adds to a mindset, doesn't it? So was there a catastrophic event, a breakdown, a decline in his ability to deal with those issues? In the weeks leading to his disappearance, friends and bandmates had noted that he was more withdrawn, but they didn't note any, you know, alarming behaviour. You know, we've seen this before, and people talk about people that actually commit suicide or plan to do, you know, significant self-harm to themselves, don't always display overtly depressed or suspicious activity. Sometimes they seem happy. They seem slightly more outgoing than normal, almost as if having that plan of action is giving them a point to achieve, to move towards something that they wouldn't have if they were within their normal cycle of mental health episodes. So nothing strange there. Looking into his activities leading up to there, it was noted that Edwards had withdrawn £200 a day from his bank account. Nobody knows what that was for. You know, the period of time, £200 a day. It was £2,800 that was withdrawn leading to his disappearance. It would be pure speculation to say he bought a plane ticket to Brazil and changed his name to Javier. You know, nobody knows. Some of Edwards' personal belongings, including receipts and photographs, were found in the car, but no note. You know, and again, it's fairly typical for somebody that is planning to do something like this, to leave some mementos, to leave something to as a form of identity. Yes, it was me that was here. There has been nothing discovered about Richey since his disappearance. You know, in November 2008, 13 years after his disappearance, he was declared presumed dead at the request of the family. Wow, what a terrible thing for the family to have to request of the courts, to have to process, to actually finalise. Yeah. Again, though, that legal step allowed for his estate to be settled, and 13 years of holding things in abeyance must have been incredibly difficult for them. And now we look at the conspiracies. You know, what happened to Richey? The question that every single music fan wants answered, every Manic Street Preachers fan wants answered. The most obvious thing is that he unfortunately committed suicide, that he drove to the Severn Bridge, that he went up onto the bridge and that he jumped. And although no body was ever found, or there was no concrete evidence of this, it is not uncommon for suicides to occur at the Severn Bridge and for there to be no physical evidence afterwards. I think if you look at the evidence some of it's circumstantial that sits around that, then I think it is more likely. And there's also the theory that he's still alive, that he did what people call a voluntary disappearance. You'll think of the J.D. Salinger, who didn't necessarily fake his own death, but he just chose to vanish and start somewhere else. I'm not overly convinced by that one. It's very romantic, that you might have the ability to hit a reset button in your life somewhere and say, "Oh, this is too much. Let's go somewhere." There's been claims of sightings of Edwards in Goa and the Canary Islands. There's been sightings all over, and I think that's almost like the Elvis Presley syndrome, isn't it? Everybody claims to have seen Elvis somewhere, and I think that when we miss somebody that we loved and we were affectionate about and that we cared about, that maybe we see them in things, or them in places when we want to see that we would want to share with them. I don't know. I think it'd be really nice to think that Richey had found some peace in his life with his struggles, that he had gone somewhere else and hit that reset, and that he was writing happy, heartwarming stories now. But I just don't think that was Richey's eventual outcome. We also get the conspiracies around foul play, that that he'd fallen in with the wrong group, that his drug use, that his mental health issues had taken him in the wrong direction, and somebody had, he'd fallen victim to foul play. Again, there is absolutely no evidence to support that. And I think that whilst, again, like him reinventing himself and starting somewhere else, it would be easier for us as fans to accept that he had been a victim of foul play, as opposed to somebody who had taken his own life and not left a note to explain. If we think about episode 1 and we think about Kurt Cobain left a note. Cobain left almost a narrative of where he was, how he was, and why he couldn't continue. And for Richey, somebody so well known for his lyrical prowess, not to leave something, that makes it so much more complicated to actually understand what he actually did. It would have been, I don't know, I think given his lyrical style and the way he wrote, I think his suicide note, in a very, very strange and very, very dark way, and I do apologise for this, but I wonder what he would have written. It certainly wouldn't have been something as plain and boring as "I've had enough." It would have been something that would have made people think and ponder and remember him. Yeah. When asked in an interview not long after Richey's disappearance if there was anything more that the band could have done, James Dean Bradfield responded, "Everyone can act with hindsight and say they could have done more, but there was a lot that was done, a lot that was being done. It was a complicated time." How painful must that be for a friend? Nicky Wire saying that he had probably blanked it out, that the band had told themselves he was writing about these dark things in a journalistic kind of way, writing from the point of view of an anorexic, and so much of our stuff was loaded in that way. So that was a full stop, an unexpected full stop for the band. They would say it was a comma, but the band would never be the same again, and that is 100% understandable. They didn't know at that point whether they would continue. We as fans, reeling from the loss of Richey, from the potential loss of the band, didn't know what to expect next. It was we can only presume to think it must have been the worst of times for them. And what happened next was nothing short of miraculous. Tell your friends, tell your loved ones, share your experiences, tell me your stories. We'll do a special episode at some point on what the Manics mean to you guys. Let's keep this thing going. Thank you.